Welcome to Navigate Now. This is the podcast where we discuss everything around people and places. I'm your host, Jon Docksey, and I'm super excited to have Joe on this episode because we're going to talk about navigating after hours. Hi, Joe. Thanks for joining us.
That's no problem. My name is Jo, and I'm self-labelled Queen of the Night. I love everything about our cities at night time. I've been a passionate lover of after dark since I was a teenager. There are parts of our cities and towns that are exciting and vibrant and unknown, and the possible becomes impossible, and the impossible becomes possible. And so it's just an area that has really fascinated me because it's an area that's completely lacked governance, structure. For such a long time, we've often seen it as an area that is filled with problems rather than solutions and excitement and potential. And yet I see it for all of its wonderful potential. I kind of fell into it. As I said, I love nighttime economy since I was a young person. I got into it. I organised raves back in the 90s in forests and places like that. And then I got sensible jobs. But one of the jobs that I did was I worked for a big fast-moving consumer goods company, and I was head of what was called gang and plantation management. So I worked out in some of their most problematic communities with young people in drugs, gangs, etc. And I got offered a job in Nottingham to lead a charity to turn the city around after dark. It had become known as binge drinking Nottingham, Shottingham, a variety of other different things. And I led a charity there for 8 years with the aim of turning the city around from one that had a really bad reputation to one that had a good reputation. And then I went to work in some other cities like Manchester. And then cities just started to ask me what I had done in those areas. And so I just thought I could set up a business to do that, share that knowledge. And now we work globally. Someone said to me the other day that the rise of the nighttime economy and the work that you have been doing is really impressive, but I've never really thought about it like that. One of the things that really inspired me was someone that I loved had been murdered walking home from work one night. And I thought I didn't want anyone else to ever experience anything like that again. He was a human rights lawyer walking home from work one night and got caught up, unfortunately, in some gang warfare where they picked on him. And so for me, it was a real mixture of love of the night and love of everything that is creative and vibrant and music and alive and great food and culture and art. And then that mixture on the other side of what happens when things go horribly wrong. And then the experience that I had got working for this fast-moving consumer goods company, working with young people in really problematic situations and turning that around to get them into employment and skills. So it just kind of felt like all of my skills that collided into one place. And so for me, it's not really a job. I call it a calling. I feel very called to work in this field and have done now for over 17 years. And so I've gathered a lot along the way. I'm like a stone gathering moss as I travel. And some of the things that I've learned, I never intended to learn, but have.
Brilliant. I love that because we're all part of that, no pun intended from a wayfinding perspective, but everyone's part of that journey. And I love asking that question because we've all got a tapestry to tell and we can't curate that and design that in that sense, but one thing leads to the other. And before we jump into the conversation, which I'm super excited and looking forward to, I'd love ways to find out a little bit about the person behind the conversation. So it'd be great if we could share something fun or unexpected, maybe about Joe the person, so we can kind of know a little bit about an insight into Joe.
Of course. One thing I love, wild, as you might have discovered, one thing that I love is cold water swimming. All year long, rain, snow, ice, sunshine. You will find me at the beach, swimming in the sea or in lakes or in rivers. And it just makes me feel alive. Everyone thinks I'm a bit crazy, but I really enjoy it.
Yeah.
Fall to the wild.
I hear that a lot. I hear that people saying that it has those benefits, but I've never taken the plunge. That sounds incredible.
Can I invite you to come for a cold water swim with me at some point?
Yeah.
Everyone gives me that look.
It sounds amazing. Yeah, I like a bit of adventure, but yeah, I've never gone that far yet. But that sounds really cool. Love it. So, thanks for the intro. Thanks for the heads up on a little bit about your journey and where you come from. So, I want to find out a little bit about why you mentioned kind of nighttime economy. And you mentioned already about kind of it being a problem solving question rather than a positive intervention in that sense. So I want to find out a little bit in our first little part of our conversation about why the nighttime economy matters and how we can create vibrant after dark strategies for towns, cities, and I'm guessing like one thing I was thinking about in preparation for this episode was, is it just all about towns and cities? Are there other aspects that we can learn from towns and cities for other types of areas and destinations as well? But maybe just to kick off, why is the nighttime economy important now more than maybe ever?
That's such a good question. So if we look at young people, it's the number one reason why they choose cities to study in. It's really important for a happy workforce. It's really important for well-being, and a thriving nighttime economy supports people, not just profits. It's about how a place feels after dark. Is it safe, welcoming, lively? Can people work, travel, and socialize with dignity? It's a vibrant ecosystem, from care workers and musicians to taxi drivers, security staff, cleaners. And a successful nighttime economy celebrates local culture. It supports diverse activities from quiet cafes to late night galleries. And it's really important for keeping places accessible and welcoming and livable. When we think about success beyond football and profit, we're thinking about women feeling safe to go out and return home, night workers being respected and valued, public spaces that are cared for as much during the day as they are at night and animated and clean, and culture that's visible and accessible at nighttime, residents feeling included rather than ignored. And I can give a really good example of that one. Late night noise, which keeps residents awake after dark, is not acceptable, but actually culture is really important. And then the other one is about governance structures that both listen and then act. And I think you asked me, can I share examples of towns and cities that have done nighttime placemaking particularly well? I think if we look at Ireland at the moment, they have a national pilot programme. It's the first country in the world to adopt a nighttime economy strategy. They launched a nighttime economy task force in September 2021. And as part of that, they've appointed nighttime economy advisors in 9 pilot towns and cities. So if we think about what they're doing right, it's a national systemic approach, not piecemeal local fixes. And that replicates across towns and cities and the countryside as well. They have coordinated rollout with 9 pilots adopting clear governance frameworks and deep investment in local engagement, stakeholder forums, data-backed strategies. So I think as we think about our towns and cities at night time, it's not just bars and restaurants or nightclubs, which is what we traditionally thought of as a nighttime economy. Now we're operating in a very 24-hour environment, and our nighttime economies are just as vital as our daytime economies. And sometimes, because we're working globally, it means that those people who are working in the day are also working at night. So we think of lawyers, bankers, financial people. If we think of traditional service industries, if we think of kind of warehouses, transport, many things now are operating 24 hours a day, and yet we don't have the same accessibility at night as we do during the day to things like high quality food, to transport, to even wayfinding. So if we look and
facilities like toilets and all the other aspects, they often get closed up at a certain time. One question I was going to maybe kind of for someone listening to this, maybe for the first time or coming across the nighttime economy as a as a discipline for the first time. What is the nighttime economy? Is there in the industry a kind of like, we always debate when is evening?
Yeah, absolutely.
We know when the morning is. We know when night is to a degree. When's evening? What do we determine? Because I'm thinking kind of specifically in the UK, where you get through the calendar a diverse range of dark. Sometimes in the UK it can be dark at 4 p.m. Sometimes at 10 p.m. So have you coined what is the nighttime economy?
I think the nighttime economy refers to all social, cultural, and economic activity that happens between the hours of 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. So traditionally kind of post-work and pre-work for those who work normal 9 to 5. And it really includes much more than just bars and clubs. It's an ecosystem that touches almost every part of life. We think about hospitality, so restaurants, pubs, takeaways, street food, cultural and entertainment, theatre, live music venues, cinemas, galleries, retail, late night shopping, convenience stores, markets, transport, buses, taxis, trains, ride shares, parking services, public services, so policing, the NHS, social care, waste teams, then well-being and welfare, so things like safe spaces, late night pharmacies, outreach teams, and then essential services, so cleaners, couriers, delivery drivers, logistics, and 24/7 operations. And the reason it matters is because the nighttime economy is a major employer and driver of local growth. In the UK alone, it contributes tens of billions to the economy and supports around 1 in 8 jobs. But it's also about something deeper. It's about how we gather, create, connect, and how we care for one another after dark. And a healthy nighttime economy is safe, diverse, inclusive, vibrant, and it supports workers, brings communities together, reflects the unique identity of a place, and it's not just a party scene.
I love that, because kind of when we talk about wayfinding, people think wayfinding is just about signs. It's just about having a sign in the right corner of the street, etc., etc. And there's such a diverse dynamic around accessibility and compliance, and so many other aspects that we talk about on this podcast and in projects. But I love that, because kind of like we've discussed at the head of this conversation, the nighttime economy has its kind of preconception of problems and crime and dark and but as you said, from 7 till 7, well, even some parts of the year, maybe a vast percentage of that is actually daylight. Or not a majority, but a decent proportion could be actually daylight. So it's important to start to understand, like you said, waste and healthcare and retail and entertainment is one of those aspects. I love that, how it can be at that breadth of thinking to make that economy sustainable and lasting.
It's so important. And some of the biggest risks or misconceptions we see around developing nighttime strategies are that people just see it as a bolt-on or a public order problem. But this leads to fragmented and reactive policies. And we need to make the assumption now that it's much more than just bars or young people, because that excludes all these essential workers who are working at night. And over-regulation and policing really stifles creativity, equity, community ownership, and balancing strategies to juggle kind of commerce, care, culture, and wayfinding, as you say. So often I walk into cities and there's signs and they say, well, we've got signs, Joe, but I try and read them at night and they're black on grey, and you cannot read black on grey at night time. Or it's just purely those signs that point people to the train station or to this location. But actually, when we're looking at signage and wayfinding, it's really evolved. So now we need to bring in phones. We need to bring in natural footfall and flow to places. We need to build in recommendations, and footfall changes at night time than it does during the day. So where areas that are busy during the day often aren't busy at night time. And yet all of the work for wayfinding has been done to make the area welcome during the day, not necessarily at night. And the perception, therefore, of a city during the day versus at night can really change as a result of not doing it well.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a nice segue onto kind of something else I wanted to pick up. Like how navigation adapts and changes after dark. So I wanted to explore like a little bit of the nighttime focus. Obviously, you say kind of the default is daytime, and we want to shift that perception of daytime is just 50% of that 24-hour period in that sense. I know you've written a blog and you've talked about a safe and welcoming environment in the nighttime economy isn't just about what happens behind doors. It's also about how people move between them. And I like that line of how people move between them because 100% we can solve wayfinding for a destination. And I always say wayfinding is about 2Ds.
Yeah,
It's about destination,
yeah,
but also discovery. I might
yeah.
go into a place and want a particular venue or a location, but then when I'm there, I can increase my dwell time and I can increase my experience by going and discovering so many other places. What do you think that looks like in practice within the nighttime economy of the dynamics that change in that particular period?
Such a good question. So, our experience of place changes profoundly when the sun goes down. A street
Mm,
that feels lively and safe in daylight can suddenly feel isolating, unfamiliar, or threatening at night. It's not just about visibility, it's about psychology, emotion, and sensory perception. And after dark, we need to realize that our senses work differently. We rely much more on sound, light, and spatial memory than on visual
yeah.
cues, and we become more aware of our surroundings and our vulnerabilities, especially if we're alone or in an unfamiliar area or part of a group that has historically felt unsafe at night. And landmarks can disappear into shadows, paths can
Yeah.
feel ambiguous or unsafe, even if they're physically the same. So we need to adapt our wayfinding, therefore. So, in terms of then adapting it using illumination or reflective signage, saying you are here, maps, directional arrows, and symbols should be easy to see and interpreted, even in low light. Using soft lighting to highlight landmarks after dark or outline key buildings, art, trees, all help orientate people. And using light as a language, so consistent lighting along preferred routes communicates safety and direction and tells people this is where you go. And if
Hmm.
we look at cities like Barcelona and Copenhagen, they use layered lighting, soft for ambient, bright at crossing and junctions, and what that does is to help guide the flow without overstimulating people. We
Yeah.
also need to prioritize human scale design. Wayfinding should be designed at the height and scale that people use it. So often we'll
Without a
find
doubt.
cities that signs have been designed by men for men, but women at
Yeah.
5'2" or 5'4" maybe find them too high or too cluttered for use. So therefore, it becomes really important that we prioritize how humans use that. Often in cities, I use something called a nighttime audit, and we will take members of the council, the police, residents, focus groups
Mm,
out on a walk around the city with us, and we'll get them to point out things that don't align with those priorities. And people always say to me, I'm amazed, Joe, I've never walked a city at night and thought about it in this kind of way. Um, but it's really important that we use also things like symbols and pictograms, not just text. And this is really helpful also for neurodivergent or
yeah.
tourists who don't speak the language. As I said, I work globally, so I'm regularly working in cities around the world, and I approach it in a way that then says I have no idea where I am and where I'm
Yeah.
going, and I might not speak the language. As I said, I'm in Lisbon, and I don't speak Portuguese incredibly well. I speak it well, but not perfectly. So it's really important if we think of the high number of people who are coming into our area as tourists and how do we get them to use it. Creating sensory cues is another one. So looking at tactile paving, audible cues, contrasting surfaces to support navigation, scent, sound, soft music, water features near gathering points, signal safety and a welcome, and also highlight destinations, not just routes. At night, people don't want to know how to get somewhere. They want to know what's open, what's safe, and what's nearby. So using signage or QR linked maps to open
Yeah.
venues and transport options, toilets and safe spaces are so important. If we look at what Google's doing at the moment, so in one city that we're working with, they're actually creating a nighttime walking map of that city, which
Love it.
highlights things where they can go to. And so you'll download the map, you'll be able to go and walk the city, and they're taking you along safe routes. So they're not taking you down back streets or up a million stairs or through parks. They're actually creatively curating that walk. And I think we really should be thinking about these modern ways of curating wayfinding far beyond is it just signage, because it's about calming the nervous system, reducing uncertainty, inviting people to feel held by the place. And when we design for how people feel at night and not just how they move, we create spaces that are not only functional but actually deeply human. And that's really important when we're designing cities. We need to move away from designing for one particular person, but a total humanity of people that will be using those spaces at night.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things in there kind of around accessibility, which is really important. And another episode we had with a guy called Mark Conte, we were talking about accessibility. It doesn't just tick the box or improve the experience for those with those needs, but it improves for everybody. So things you mentioned there around pictograms, plain English, if it's the UK you're working in, or another territory, another country, another language, so people with an opening to that language can still access that information. I think that's really important. But about kind of using other aspects, so lighting is important as well to create that sense of welcome. I often think wayfinding is just like holding someone's hand and guiding them through a space. And that's exactly what you would do if you are with somebody who had been there before. You would take their hand and you'd say, no, it's safe. This is the right route. You confirm, you have that trust, that reassurance that this is the way to go. And I think using those various aspects and those interventions that you mentioned are definitely some positives. I always like for listeners to this particular podcast to go away with some top tips, some little nuggets that they can take into their particular place, whether it be a town, a city, small, big, modern, historic, tourist dominated or resident focused. What would be a couple of things you can think of that a custodian of a place could start thinking about that would improve their particular environment?
That's such a good question. So if we think about who is using these spaces, so let's identify local workers, for example. They're often travelling home alone after services stop, or when services are very busy, potentially with people who are very intoxicated. So one of the things around suggested fixes are communal apps that they can use to allow people to say, I'm leaving my workplace, this is the route that I'm going to take, this is when I expect I'm going to get home. Community shuttles, for example, for night workers would be a really good one. Specific bus services set on for those who are finishing work an hour after everybody else has gone to make sure that they can get home safely. If we're thinking about young people in the community, they don't necessarily have late spaces to gather safely or areas that are communal where they could hang out. So putting places in our city centres where young people can come together and not be told off for making noise, and making sure that that is highlighted to people is really important. Visitors and tourists, they expect closures, but they find no orientation after dark, so they don't really know where to go or how to get there. So making sure we've got digital maps, whether that be on our phones or other ways, live bus information, local signage at key landmarks, pointing them towards bus stops or trams or taxis, making sure that they can get there. For other people, it's about asset-backed lighting, so footpath maintenance, neighbourhood watch patrols, making sure that people are not walking on unlit streets, or if we have got unlit streets, that they are lit. And when we think about lighting in this particular format, it doesn't have to be overhead lighting. Often that can make people feel really vulnerable. So thinking creatively, particularly if you're in areas where you have good sunlight, where we could use kind of solar lighting to light paths, where we could use creative lighting in trees, where we could have creative art-led signposts, which would make people feel more at home and welcome. So it's not just plain signage that we're talking about. So some of those things I think are really important. It's really important for community cohesion. So night
Mm-hmm.
can be an amazing opportunity where we can encourage people to walk our areas, do stargazing, get involved in open air cinemas, walking, etc. All of those things are so important. So I
Yeah,
think top actions really for towns and cities are: do an audit of your late night walking routes for safety and lighting. Do think about pedestrian lighting in creative ways, not just in traditional ways. Do think about creative pop-up spaces, which could be used in areas to signpost that you're in an area that is welcoming and inclusive. And do think about digital tools.
yeah, definitely. I think there's some important aspects there that we can consider. One other thing that was across my mind was we talked about the cities, we talked about town centre areas. Are there other learnings that we can take from those particular destination types into other areas, those connections between? So if we're in a town and we need to get back to a residential area, are there any studies of how that last mile in the reverse? We always talk about that last mile to get to our destination, but in reverse, I'm always interested that wayfinding is about from leaving home to destination,
Yeah,
and the bit that's forgotten is getting back again.
yeah. And
And
yes,
are there any studies around that kind of work?
yeah, it's really interesting because you ask any woman what happens when she plans her night out, the first thing she will ever tell you is she plans her route home. Um,
Yeah.
and yet, that's not traditionally something that men who design our towns and cities necessarily think about. But intertown
Mm.
mobility does really matter. In rural or semi-urban areas, poor transport means the night can feel very isolating. And a recent
Mm.
UK study found that for every 20% drop in satisfaction with public and active transport, loneliness increases by 5%. And so those who don't live in city centres can end up being quite isolated. And even in small intertown bus routes or informal car shares become critical social lifelines. And without them, the night becomes a barrier rather than a bridge. When we think about pedestrian infrastructure in market towns, often it isn't designed for dark hours. Limited lighting, no late services, empty streets, all of that deters people from venturing out and therefore negatively impacts the economy, even if there are one or two spaces that are open. And then you talked about studies. So, yes, there are some studies. So, there was one done in 2007, which was a long time ago, of British
Yeah.
towns that showed that towns faced real struggles at night. Increased licensed premises didn't necessarily boost feelings of safety, especially in rural areas. Um, and then a recent Urbact report highlights how 24-hour mobility planning is essential, citing places like Tallinn, adding night buses on weekends to bridge the social inactivity gap. But really, it's a barrier. So if we don't get our late night transport, and if we don't look at active transport, and this is such an important one now. So we think of e-scooters,
Yeah.
e-bikes, walking routes, cycling routes. We think about taxis, ride shares, buses, trams, trains. Wherever I go, people will say they don't run late enough or regularly enough to enable them to get home safely. If we look at ride shares in particular, Uber, Bolt, etc., picking up people in towns and cities on street corners, which can make them really vulnerable because
Yeah.
you don't know who you're getting into a car with. So some cities we're seeing are putting in ride share points where they're actually making them go to a point where there's an ANPR camera. It's checked on the ANPR cameras. They come up to that space. So they're almost guaranteeing better safety than just picking people up randomly in random locations. So I think there's a lot to be done still in terms of making sure that our late night signposting, wayfinding, walking, transport routes are better.
Yeah, definitely. And we talked a little bit about accessibility there, and I'm interested, how does nighttime navigation differ for people with visual impairment, mobility impairment? You mentioned neurodiversion situations in that sense,
Yeah,
because it's important that we open up our towns and cities to everybody,
yeah,
and hold their hand in that sense in different situations. I love the example that you referenced that Google are doing around how we can kind of curate those routes for a particular time of the day. But it's often important when we're designing wayfinding maps, for example, that we show you where those slopes are, steps are. So if that is your have mobility impairment, you can then choose the route that's right for your particular needs in that sense. What top 2 or 3 things come to mind when we're thinking about the nighttime economy and those with accessibility needs?
So true. Wayfinding is so much more than visibility. It's really emotional infrastructure, and it shapes how we feel in space and how we move through it and whether we stay or go. And that's really important when it comes to those people who have access needs. Lighting is really important, but so is the wider language of wayfinding, because it helps us to read a space and whether it's welcoming, threatening, vibrant, dormant, open,
Yeah.
closed. And a job well done, it can dramatically improve wayfinding, safety, and the overall atmosphere. So I think if we think about wayfinding, things like directional lighting, color coded lighting, threshold lighting is really important because they subtly guide our movements and it links pathways, bollards, building edges, orientating without needing a map.
Yeah.
If we're thinking about kind of color coding zones or putting in areas where we're thinking transit, rest, cultural, it helps people unconsciously navigate a space. We need to think about pavement sizes and what's obstructing those, particularly for wheelchair users. When we do focus groups with wheelchair users, they say increasingly people are putting rubbish on pavement, so it means that they can't get past. Those people who have sight issues are saying they will trip over things or they have to walk round things because they realise that there's litter on the pavement or there's signposts being put up in the way that push them out into the street. So our wayfinding is much more about not just about lighting or signage, it's about how do people actually navigate the spaces that we're in, and are we making them accessible to all people? We also need to think about safety. So people feel safer when they can see and be seen, and soft, evenly distributed lighting avoids deep shadows and doesn't create glare. And if we think about kind of layering then our cities, so we're combining street lamps with signage and ambient lighting from windows, it really does make people feel alive rather than empty. And if we think about cities like Barcelona and Copenhagen, as I said, they've used lighting to increase perceived natural surveillance, which helps people feel part of a collective urban fabric and not just isolated. So it's much more about using kind of vibrant colours, soft ambient lighting to transform edgy alleyways or edgy spaces into social and interactive spaces. Making people able to use their phones and see what's on their screen is also really important, as is having signage to direct people into the right place, or having lighting that says come this way because this is where you're safe and welcome and there's activity and things going on. So I think sorry, go ahead.
And I love the idea of lighting, not using that guy. You can get the off the shelf street lamps, and you can be compliant and you can light up a footpath, can't you? But using the uplighting and the kind of lighting of buildings and other trees, and like you mentioned, you can start to tell a story of a place. And that's something else that we talk about a lot kind of on this particular podcast, is telling the story of an environment, of a place, of a destination. And you can start to pull those layers. You mentioned layers of a place. You can start to pull those layers apart. And then it becomes memorable and it becomes unique, because a lot of things that towns and cities are trying to get away from, isn't it, about just being a carbon copy of somebody else?
Absolutely.
That Barcelona that you mentioned, to a London, to a New York, to a Paris, to a whatever large or small cities, we all have our own story to tell. And I think lighting, I saw a good example of lighting being used, and it was in Manchester, actually onto the footpaths at night time, giving you different directions to different destinations that are nighttime specific. Even like in IKEA, they would use lighting rather than vinyls on floors to show routes. And yes, they have their benefits, and one of those is the adaptability of that. So take that, you could put event information into that. You could put all sorts of changing or temporary information by using lighting as a navigation cue that you just couldn't do if it was a permanent fixed product.
Absolutely. If you look at Eindhoven in the Netherlands and their Glow Light Festival and their smart light trails, that's such a good example of that. So it's the Glow Festival isn't just about art, it's about navigation. And during the event, Light Trail winds through the city using colour-changing street lights, ground-level projections, illuminated markers to guide people between venues, and the route changes colour in sync with the schedule. So even if you don't have a map, the lighting literally leads the way. And it was one of the amazing things that I've ever experienced in terms of really great wayfinding. So it combined projections, super graphics, color trails, and I just thought it was a really great way of getting people to navigate the city in a really non-functional way.
And maybe just I'm super excited having this conversation in that sense, but maybe just a couple of things to bring us and to wrap us up. You talked about the various groups needs from female groups to nighttime workers to the youth demographic, etc. How do we involve communities into this conversation about designing nighttime spaces and systems? How do we bring them into the conversation to ensure that there isn't that sign that's designed for an average male when the average female is of a different height, or not just the male or female standing and the wheelchair user in that sense? How do we see good examples of communities being involved in this approach?
Yes, such an important question, and this is a lot of the work that we do. So I think firstly, it's about having I call them focus groups, but a group of individuals that are representative of the community that use the nighttime economy. Inviting them in to have conversations. I like to use night audits or night walks. So would recommend doing a night walk once a quarter and inviting people to come on that walk with you, to look at the city, town area in a slightly different way with fresh eyes, to pick up areas that don't feel safe or areas that could do with creative wayfinding. From that group, we then create things like a task and finish group. What are we going to do with that? I also like to bring in conversations with people who don't use the town or city at night time. Their voice is really important because they don't use it for a particular reason, and making sure that their voice is heard, and we've talked about it with them. I then like to use e-surveys. So e-surveys are a really great way of finding out what a wider, broader public think, and I tend to do those once a year so that I can measure against kind of last year versus this year.
See changes, the differences, improvements, challenges.
Absolutely, because it does absolutely change. It's really important to gather perceptions also from those who work at night, so from police officers, cleaners, bar staff, etc., because they're using those areas at nighttime regularly, and so we'll be able to give you really good advice. This is about a regular conversation, not just a once-off. Some people say, "Oh, I consulted people. I spoke to them 3 years ago," and I think, goodness, so much changed in the last 3 years. It's a regular conversation that needs to be had with your community about what is and isn't working. The other thing that I really like to do is to keep my pulse on what else is happening around the world. So now with AI, you can easily set up an AI tool, a reminder to go and bot for you and find out what else is happening and to gather some of that information back. I think using night-specific maps, online and physical, will show you, especially if you're using tools such as Google, Waze, etc., then you will be able to find out where people are using the city at night. I recently wrote a blog on how can we use footfall counters in order to help city data at night time. And I'm still amazed at how little footfall cameras or footfall counters are being used in order to record and look at how people are moving around our town and city at night. They give you such valuable data. So I think there's a combination of different things when we think about prioritizing kind of how people walk through towns and cities, and designing routes that are intuitive, visible and cared for by involving the people in those discussions about what is working, what isn't working, what could be done better.
Yeah, so if we've got someone listening then to the episode who's from a smaller town, what kind of recommendations or things that we can get them thinking about where they might not have the budget or the scope of a bigger town or a city?
That's such a good question. So anybody can do a nighttime audit. So
Yeah.
they're kind of free time, I suppose, of the people who might be involved in doing it. You can do that once a quarter. That would involve walking the area in between the hours of, say, 7 p.m. and if you're a smaller area, maybe 11 p.m. And then looking at it with fresh eyes. So and the kind of thing you're looking for are there any areas that make me feel unsafe? Are there any areas where I can or can't navigate easily? Are there any areas that I feel that could be brought to life better by animation? When we think about wayfinding in those areas, we don't need to be spending a huge amount of money. So you could involve your local community and young people in designing signage, for example, and maybe applying for an Arts Council grant to work with local artists to create something in your local area. You could be looking at solar lighting. Again, it doesn't cost lots of money to put in solar lighting. So some of these things don't cost a huge amount of money and could actually be upkept by local groups of people who kind of have an interest in that specific area. So you don't always have to think about spending lots of money. When we think about footfall counters, there's some really great new to the market footfall counters which cost thousands of pounds rather than hundreds of thousands of pounds. And so you could be using some of these to think about how do we work out where people are using our town and our city at night time, or a smaller area at night time. So just because you're a small area doesn't mean that these things are inaccessible to you. You just need to think a little bit more creatively about it.
No, I love that. I think there's some really cool takeaways that we can think about when we've recapped from this particular episode. I think that's really cool. I'd really love to have this conversation on this particular episode, Joe. It's been fantastic. Thanks for taking the time out of your day to be part of this podcast. Maybe just give me a bit of a feel of people have learned lots about your experience and what you do. Where can we find out more about Joe?
You can go to nighttimeeconomy.com and get in contact with me there, or I have LinkedIn. It's just Jo Cox Brown on LinkedIn. You can come, and I regularly post and blog on my LinkedIn, or you can find me on Instagram as well. It's just Jo Cox Brown on Instagram. So I am around and about, always happy to have a chat with people as well. If they've got any specific questions related to their area, feel free to get in contact with me. At Joe.
Cool, perfect. So we'll make sure we put all those links in the description below these particular episodes so you can reach out with Joe. And it just leaves me to say thanks very much for joining us on this episode. Super exciting content that we've been able to discuss there about the importance, the depth and the breadth of what the nighttime economy is, what it isn't, who it involves, who it doesn't, and how we just need to raise the profile to ensure that our towns and cities are being used to the best that it can be throughout the day, the duration of the 24-hour day in that sense, and make it work for everybody that can benefit from those particular places. So thanks very much.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan. I really appreciate it. It was a lovely conversation, a great hour.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Navigate Now. We've unpicked all the key aspects of how we can make great places in our towns and city centres after dark. If you want to continue on this conversation and go with us as we explore everything around people and places, be sure to subscribe, like, and follow us on Spotify and YouTube to continue in this conversation. I've been your host, Jon Docksey, and I'm thankful to Joe for joining us on this episode and look forward to continuing the conversation.